In the world of military aviation, where the roar of jet engines drowns out whispered doubts and the sky becomes a battlefield of pride and prejudice, one woman's quiet determination would shatter every assumption about what it means to fly. Sarah Chen had spent years being underestimated, overlooked, and ridiculed by colleagues who saw only her reserved demeanor and assumed weakness where there was actually steel. But on one fateful morning, when her F-5 Tiger II would slice through the atmosphere in a dive so precise and powerful that it defied the very laws of physics her critics thought they understood, the aviation world would learn that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. This is the story of how a woman who spoke softly but carried the heart of a warrior proved that excellence doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply performs when the moment demands, nothing less than perfection. The morning mist clung to the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base like a shroud of uncertainty, and Sarah Chen pulled her flight jacket tighter as she approached the F-5 Tiger II that would soon become an extension of her very soul. The year was 1987, and the world of military aviation remained largely a boys' club where women had to fight twice as hard to earn half the respect their male counterparts received without question. Sarah had learned this lesson early and often throughout her career, but she had also learned something else equally important. That proving yourself didn't always require shouting from the rooftops. Sometimes the most powerful statements were made in complete silence. At 28, Sarah possessed an unusual combination of qualities that made her both an exceptional pilot and a frequent target for ridicule. Her voice rarely rose above a conversational tone, even during the most heated briefings. She preferred to observe and analyze rather than dominate discussions with loud opinions. When other pilots gathered around the bar after long training sessions, swapping stories and boasting about their aerial achievements, Sarah would often slip away quietly to study technical manuals or review flight data. Her colleagues interpreted this behavior as antisocial or worse, as evidence that she lacked the aggressive confidence necessary for combat aviation. What they failed to understand was that Sarah's quiet nature masked an intensity that burned hotter than any rocket engine. She had grown up in a small town in Oregon, the daughter of an aircraft mechanic father and a mathematics teacher mother. From childhood, she had been fascinated by the precise engineering required to make tons of metal defy gravity, and she approached flying with the same methodical precision that her mother brought to complex equations. While other pilots relied on instinct and bravado, Sarah studied aerodynamics until she could visualize airflow patterns in her sleep. She understood her aircraft not just as a machine to be controlled, but as a complex system whose every component had been designed with specific tolerances and capabilities. This morning's mission would test those capabilities to their absolute limits. The assignment seemed routine on paper, a high-altitude reconnaissance flight followed by a series of aerobatic maneuvers designed to evaluate the F-5's performance envelope under extreme conditions. But Sarah knew that nothing about military aviation was ever truly routine, and she had spent the previous evening poring over weather reports and technical specifications with her characteristic thoroughness. The ridicule had started early that morning in the briefing room. Captain Jake Morrison, a swagger-filled pilot with more ego than actual flight hours, had made a show of questioning whether Sarah could handle the psychological pressure of high-G maneuvers. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, the squadron leader whose prejudices were as outdated as his flight techniques, had suggested that perhaps Sarah would be more comfortable with less demanding aircraft. Even Major Lisa Rodriguez, one of the few other women in the program, had remained silent during these exchanges, unwilling to risk her own precarious position by defending a colleague who seemed unwilling to defend herself. Sarah had endured it all without a word, her face maintaining the same calm expression that had earned her the nickname Stoneface among her peers. But behind those steady brown eyes, a fire had been building for months. Every dismissive comment, every condescending suggestion, every assumption about her limitations had been carefully catalogued and stored away like fuel, waiting for ignition. Today, whether her tormentors realized it or not, would be the day that fuel finally caught fire. The F-5 Tiger II was not the most advanced fighter jet in the American arsenal, but it was a machine that demanded respect. Originally designed as a lightweight, cost-effective fighter for Allied nations, the F-5 had earned a reputation for being both reliable and unforgiving. Its twin General Electric J85 engines could push the aircraft to speeds exceeding Mach 1.6, but the real test of any pilot's skill came in how they handled the jet's tendency toward aggressive behavior during high-speed maneuvers. The F-5 rewarded precision and punished overconfidence, making it the perfect aircraft for a pilot whose strengths lay in technical mastery rather than flashy showmanship. As Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection, She moved with the deliberate care of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Her hands traced along the aircraft surfaces, checking for any signs of stress or damage that might compromise performance at altitude. She examined the engine intakes for foreign objects, verified that all external panels were properly secured, and confirmed that the landing gear showed no signs of hydraulic leaks. Other pilots often rushed through these checks, eager to get airborne and demonstrate their prowess. Sarah knew better. The morning sun was beginning to burn away the mist as Sarah climbed into the cockpit, her movements efficient and practiced. The F-5's instrument panel spread before her like the control room of a spaceship, dozens of gauges and switches waiting to be brought to life. She began the startup sequence with the same methodical approach she applied to everything else. Each step performed exactly as specified in the technical manuals she had long since memorized. Engine start was smooth, the familiar whine of the J-85 turbojets rising to operational pitch as various systems came online. Sarah's eyes moved constantly across the instrument panel, monitoring oil pressure, engine temperature, hydraulic systems, and electrical output. Everything appeared normal, but she knew that normal was just the starting point. Today's mission would push both her aircraft and her own abilities far beyond the comfortable realm of normal operations. Ground control cleared her for taxi, and Sarah guided the F-5 toward the active runway with the smooth precision that had become her trademark. Other pilots often used taxi time to show off with aggressive acceleration or sharp turns that demonstrated their confidence and skill. Sarah maintained a steady pace, using the time to complete final systems checks and mentally rehearsed the complex maneuvers she would soon perform at altitude. The radio crackled with tower communications as other aircraft in the pattern reported their positions and intentions. Sarah listened carefully to each transmission, building a mental picture of the airspace around Edwards and identifying potential conflicts or complications. Flying was never just about controlling your own aircraft. It required constant awareness of every other airplane within dozens of miles, along with weather conditions that could change rapidly and dramatically affect flight operations. As she waited in the run-up area for final clearance, Sarah's mind wandered briefly to the events that had led her to this moment. Her path to military aviation had been anything but straightforward. Unlike many of her colleagues who had dreamed of flying since childhood, Sarah had initially planned to pursue a career in aerospace engineering. She had excelled in mathematics and physics throughout high school and had earned a full scholarship to study engineering at the University of California. But during her sophomore year, she had attended an air show that featured a demonstration by the Air Force's precision flying team. And something about the perfect geometry of their formations had awakened a desire she hadn't known existed. The decision to change course and pursue flight training had surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. Sarah had always been the quiet, studious one, more comfortable with books and equations than with the kind of high-risk, high-adrenaline activities that attracted most pilots. But she had learned that true courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about acting in spite of that fear, when something important was at stake. Flight school had presented challenges that went far beyond mastering the technical aspects of aviation. Sarah had discovered that success in military flying required not just individual skill, but also the ability to function effectively as part of a team whose members didn't always welcome diversity. She had endured countless subtle and not-so-subtle attempts to undermine her confidence. From instructors who questioned whether women possessed the physical strength for high-performance aviation, to fellow students who suggested that her quiet demeanor indicated a lack of the aggressive instincts necessary for combat. Each challenge had made her stronger and more determined. When other students struggled with the mathematical aspects of navigation and flight planning, Sarah's engineering background gave her a significant advantage. When complex weather patterns grounded less experienced pilots, Sarah's thorough understanding of meteorology allowed her to find safe routes through seemingly impossible conditions. Most importantly, when emergency situations arose that demanded calm thinking under extreme pressure, Sarah's naturally reserved temperament proved to be exactly the right quality for making critical decisions quickly and accurately. Tower Control's voice crackled through her headset, granting final clearance for takeoff. Sarah acknowledged the transmission with professional brevity and guided the F-5 onto the runway centerline. Before her stretched several thousand feet of concrete that would soon become the launching pad for a flight that would change everything. The morning air was still and clear, providing perfect conditions for the high-altitude maneuvers that would test both her skills and her aircraft's capabilities. With methodical precision, Sarah advanced the throttles to full military power, feeling the twin J-85 engines respond with a surge of acceleration that pressed her back into her seat. The F-5 gathered speed rapidly, its lightweight design allowing for shorter takeoff runs than larger, heavier fighters. As the aircraft approached rotation speed, Sarah eased back on the stick, and the jet lifted smoothly into the morning sky. Climbing through 5,000 feet, Sarah retracted the landing gear and began configuring the aircraft for high-altitude flight. The California landscape spread below her like a detailed map, but her attention remained focused on the instrument panel and the radio communications that would guide her toward the designated test area. Today's mission profile called for a climb to 40,000 feet, followed by a series of increasingly complex maneuvers designed to evaluate the F-5's performance characteristics under extreme conditions. What neither Sarah nor her ground-based observers realized was that this routine training flight would soon become something far more significant. Hidden in the morning's mission parameters was a test that would push the F-5 Tiger II beyond anything previously attempted, a maneuver so demanding and dangerous that it would require every ounce of skill, courage, and technical knowledge that Sarah had accumulated throughout her flying career. The stage was set for a demonstration that would forever change how the aviation community viewed both the F-5 Tiger II and the quiet woman who flew it with such extraordinary precision. As Sarah climbed toward the thin air of the stratosphere, she carried with her not just the hopes of proving her own capabilities, but the dreams of every pilot who had ever been underestimated because they didn't fit the traditional mold of what a fighter pilot was supposed to be. The morning sun climbed higher as the F-5 disappeared into the vast blue expanse above Edwards Air Force Base, carrying Sarah Chen toward a rendezvous with destiny that would echo through aviation history for decades to come. At 35,000 feet, the world below had transformed into an abstract painting of browns and greens, while above, the sky deepened into the rich cobalt that marked the edge of space itself. Sarah Chen maintained steady flight parameters as she approached the designated test area, her F-5 Tiger II cutting through the thin atmosphere with mechanical precision. The aircraft felt solid beneath her, responsive to every subtle input from her hands and feet. But she knew that this cooperative behavior would soon be tested beyond anything the F-5 had ever experienced. The radio crackled with updates from ground control, confirming her position and providing weather advisories that painted a picture of perfect flying conditions. Clear skies, minimal wind shear, and excellent visibility created an ideal environment for the advanced maneuvers outlined in her mission profile. But Sarah's attention was already shifting beyond the routine parameters of today's flight towards something far more ambitious and dangerous. During the previous week, while reviewing technical literature in the base library, she had discovered a classified research paper that described theoretical performance capabilities of the F-5 Tiger II that had never been tested in actual flight conditions. The paper, written by a team of aerodynamicists at NASA's Ames Research Center, suggested that under perfect atmospheric conditions and with precise pilot control inputs, the F-5 might be capable of achieving dive speeds approaching Mach 2.2, significantly faster than the aircraft's officially rated maximum velocity of Mach 1.6. The theoretical analysis had been based on wind tunnel tests and computer simulations that modeled the F-5's aerodynamic behavior under extreme conditions. According to the research, the key to achieving these unprecedented speeds lay in executing a near-vertical dive from maximum altitude while maintaining perfect aircraft attitude control and making minute adjustments to engine power settings that would optimize airflow over the aircraft's surfaces. The margin for error was essentially non-existent. Even small deviations from optimal flight parameters would result in structural failure or loss of control that would likely prove fatal. What had captured Sarah's imagination wasn't just the technical challenge of attempting such a maneuver, but the profound statement it would make about the capabilities of both the F-5 aircraft and the pilot who flew it. Every assumption about the Tiger II's performance envelope would be shattered, along with every assumption about the quiet woman who had been systematically underestimated throughout her aviation career. The dive would represent the ultimate fusion of theoretical knowledge, practical skill, and raw courage that defined the very best of military aviation. Sarah had spent countless hours during the past week analyzing every aspect of the proposed maneuver, studying aerodynamic principles until she could visualize exactly how air would flow over the F-5 surfaces during each phase of the dive. She had calculated optimal entry speeds, descent angles, and recovery procedures with the same mathematical precision her mother had taught her to apply to complex equations. Most importantly, she had identified the specific sequence of control inputs that would be required to maintain aircraft stability while pushing the Tiger II far beyond its normal operating limits. The decision to attempt the dive hadn't been made lightly. Sarah understood that she was risking not just her own life, but potentially her entire career if the maneuver failed, or if her superiors determined that she had exceeded her authority by attempting unauthorized test procedures. But the opportunity to demonstrate the true capabilities of both herself and her aircraft had proven too compelling to resist. Today's flight provided perfect conditions and complete autonomy to conduct advanced maneuvers without direct supervision from ground controllers who might order her to abort at the first sign of unusual flight parameters. Reaching the designated test area, Sarah began the prescribed series of routine maneuvers that would officially satisfy her mission requirements while serving as a warm-up for the unprecedented challenge she had planned for herself. The F-5 responded beautifully to her commands, rolling and climbing through complex patterns that showcased the aircraft's agility and her own precision as a pilot. G-forces pressed against her body during tight turns and rapid accelerations, but her physical conditioning and years of experience allowed her to maintain perfect control throughout each sequence. Ground control monitored her progress through periodic radio check-ins, confirming her position and noting that all telemetry data appeared normal. Sarah's responses were characteristically brief and professional, giving no indication of the extraordinary plans taking shape in her mind. She had learned long ago that actions spoke far more eloquently than words, especially in an environment where women were expected to prove themselves through performance rather than promises. After completing the official maneuver sequence, Sarah positioned the F-5 for what she reported to ground control as additional performance evaluation exercises. The phrase was technically accurate while providing sufficient ambiguity to avoid detailed questions about specific procedures she intended to follow. She climbed steadily toward the F-5's service ceiling, watching altitude and engine parameters closely as the aircraft approached the limits of its operational envelope. At 42,000 feet, Sarah leveled off and began the careful preparations that would determine whether her theoretical calculations could translate into actual flight performance. The air at this altitude was so thin that even small control inputs produced exaggerated responses, requiring constant attention to maintain stable flight conditions. Engine performance was also affected by the reduced air density, necessitating precise throttle management to maintain optimal power output without exceeding temperature or pressure limitations. The F-5's instrument panel displayed a complex array of data that Sarah monitored with intense concentration. Engine temperatures remained within normal parameters despite the demanding climb to maximum altitude. Fuel consumption was tracking slightly higher than usual due to the thin air, but reserves remained adequate for the planned maneuver and subsequent return to base. Most critically, all flight control systems were responding normally, with no indications of the hydraulic or electrical problems that could prove catastrophic during high-speed flight. Sarah's pulse remained steady as she configured the aircraft for the dive that would either establish her as one of aviation's most skilled test pilots or result in her becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing aircraft beyond their design limitations. She adjusted her shoulder harness to ensure maximum security during the extreme G-forces she would soon experience, and she verified that her oxygen supply was functioning properly for the rapid altitude changes that lay ahead. The moment had arrived to commit fully to a course of action that would forever change how she was viewed within the aviation community. Sarah positioned the F-5 in a shallow climb toward the optimal entry point for the dive, mentally rehearsing each phase of the complex maneuver she was about to attempt. According to her calculations, the dive would need to begin from precisely 45,000 feet at a specific airspeed and aircraft attitude that would allow the F-5 to accelerate through the sound barrier and beyond while maintaining structural integrity. The theoretical maximum speed achievable during the dive was Mach 2.2, but Sarah knew that reaching this velocity would require perfect execution of every phase of the maneuver. The slightest deviation from optimal flight parameters could result in aerodynamic instability that would make recovery impossible, or structural loads that would exceed the F-5's design limitations and cause catastrophic failure. She would be flying not just at the edge of the aircraft's envelope, but at the very boundary between controlled flight and complete destruction. Ground control's periodic radio calls continued to confirm her position and status, but Sarah knew that once she committed to the dive, she would be completely on her own. The maneuver would happen too quickly for ground controllers to provide guidance or assistance, and the extreme speeds involved would make radio communication difficult or impossible until she completed the recovery sequence. Success or failure would depend entirely on her own skill, preparation, and ability to remain calm under conditions that would challenge every aspect of her training and experience. As the F-5 climbed through 44,000 feet, Sarah made final adjustments to her flight configuration and began the mental countdown that would mark the beginning of the most demanding few minutes of her aviation career. The morning sun blazed through the cockpit canopy, illuminating instruments that would soon register readings unlike anything previously recorded in an F-5 Tiger II. Below, the Earth stretched away in all directions, a reminder of just how far she would fall if the maneuver went wrong. The radio crackled with routine traffic from other aircraft operating at lower altitudes, their pilots focused on conventional training missions that seemed almost mundane compared to the challenge Sarah was about to attempt. None of them knew that high above their heads, a quiet woman who had been ridiculed and underestimated was preparing to rewrite the performance specifications of one of military aviation's most respected aircraft. The dive that was about to begin would demonstrate capabilities that existed nowhere in official technical manuals, achieved through a combination of theoretical knowledge and practical skill that represented the very pinnacle of what was possible when human determination met mechanical precision. Reaching 45,000 feet, Sarah leveled the F-5 and began the final preparations for a maneuver that would either crown her career with unprecedented achievement or end it in spectacular failure. The moment of truth was at hand, and the quiet woman who had endured years of ridicule was about to speak with a voice louder than any words she had ever spoken. The world held its breath at 45,000 feet as Sarah Chen positioned her F-5 Tiger II for a dive that would challenge every law of physics and engineering that governed military aviation. The cockpit around her hummed with the quiet efficiency of perfectly tuned systems, each instrument displaying readings that confirmed her aircraft was performing flawlessly at the very edge of its operational envelope. But Sarah knew that flawless performance at normal parameters meant nothing when she was about to push the Tiger II into territory that existed only in theoretical calculations and computer simulations. Her hands rested lightly on the controls, feeling the subtle vibrations that transmitted the aircraft's condition directly to her fingertips. Years of flying experience had taught her to read these mechanical whispers like a native language, interpreting minute changes in engine note, slight variations in control response, and almost imperceptible shifts in aerodynamic behavior that could mean the difference between successful completion of a maneuver and catastrophic failure. Today, every one of these senses would be tested beyond anything she had previously experienced. The dive profile she had calculated required an entry angle of exactly 78 degrees from horizontal, achieved through a precise roll and pull maneuver that would orient the F-5's nose toward a point on the Earth's surface more than 8 miles below. The mathematics behind this seemingly simple procedure were extraordinarily complex, involving calculations of air density variations, compressibility effects, and structural loading factors that would change dramatically as the aircraft accelerated through different speed regimes. Sarah had spent hours during the previous week working through these calculations by hand, double-checking her results against computer models and aerodynamic tables that documented the F-5's known performance characteristics. What she was attempting lay far beyond the realm of known performance, requiring her to extrapolate from existing data and trust theoretical predictions that had never been validated through actual flight testing. The margin between success and disaster was measured in degrees of aircraft attitude and fractions of Mach numbers that could only be controlled through the kind of precision that separated merely competent pilots from true masters of their craft. Taking a deep breath of the pure oxygen flowing through her mask, Sarah initiated the maneuver that would either establish her place in aviation history or end her career in flames. She rolled the F-5 smoothly to the left, feeling the horizon rotate around her until the Earth filled her entire field of view through the cockpit canopy. The sensation was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff that dropped away into infinity. With practiced precision, Sarah pulled the stick back and applied rudder pressure that angled the Tiger II's nose toward the distant ground. The aircraft responded immediately, its aerodynamic design allowing for the kind of aggressive maneuvering that would have been impossible in larger, heavier fighters. But Sarah knew that this responsiveness was both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed for precise control inputs, it also meant that any mistake would be amplified instantly and dramatically. The dive began gradually, with the F-5's airspeed building slowly as gravity began to assert its influence over the aircraft's forward momentum. Sarah monitored her instruments constantly, watching for any indication that the maneuver was progressing outside acceptable parameters. Engine temperatures remained stable despite the changing airflow patterns created by the steep descent angle. Hydraulic pressures held steady, confirming that the flight control systems were functioning properly under the unusual loading conditions. Most critically, the airspeed indicator began to climb toward the numbers that would mark her entry into uncharted territory. Mach 0.9, Mach 1.0, Mach 1.12, each increment represented a step further beyond the F-5's normal operating envelope and closer to speeds that existed only in theoretical analyses. The aircraft's behavior remained predictable and controllable, but Sarah could feel subtle changes in control response that indicated the complex aerodynamic forces acting on the Tiger II were beginning to shift in ways that her textbooks had described, but she had never personally experienced. Ground control continued to monitor her flight through periodic radio checks, but the controllers had no way of knowing that the routine training mission they were tracking was about to become something unprecedented in the history of F-5 operations. Sarah's responses to their calls remained professional and brief, giving no indication of the extraordinary speeds and forces she was beginning to encounter as the dive progressed toward its most dangerous phase. Passing through Mach 1-3, Sarah felt the first hints of the aerodynamic phenomena that would soon test every aspect of her flying skills. The F-5's control surfaces began to exhibit the kind of sensitivity that demanded absolute precision in pilot inputs. Even slight movements of the stick or rudder pedals produced immediate and dramatic changes in aircraft attitude, requiring constant attention to maintain the exact dive angle that her calculations had identified as optimal for achieving maximum speed, while preserving structural integrity. The sound of the wind passing over the aircraft surfaces had changed from the familiar whistle of subsonic flight to something entirely different, a deep, powerful roar that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the atmosphere itself. This was the sound of air molecules being compressed and accelerated to velocities that transformed the F-5 from an aircraft into something more resembling a controlled projectile hurtling through space at incomprehensible speed. At Mach 1.5, Sarah began to encounter phenomena that no F-5 pilot had ever experienced before. The aircraft's nose wanted to pitch upward as shock waves formed and moved along the fuselage, creating pressure distributions that differed dramatically from those encountered during normal flight operations. Compensating for these effects required control inputs that seemed to contradict everything she had learned about conventional flying, forcing her to trust theoretical knowledge over instinctive reactions that had been developed through thousands of hours of conventional flight experience. The G-forces acting on her body intensified as the dive steepened and accelerated, pressing her down into her seat with a weight that made every movement require conscious effort. Her G-suit inflated automatically, squeezing her legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling in her lower extremities and causing unconsciousness. But even with this protection, Sarah could feel the physical strain of forces that were approaching the limits of human tolerance. Engine performance remained surprisingly stable despite the unprecedented conditions. The twin J-85 turbojets were actually operating more efficiently in the dense airflow created by the high-speed dive, their intake systems designed with enough margin to handle airflow velocities that exceeded normal specifications. But Sarah knew that this stable operation was balanced on a knife's edge. Even small variations in engine power could create asymmetric thrust conditions that would make the aircraft uncontrollable at these extreme speeds. Mach 1.7, Mach 1.8, Mach 1.9, the airspeed indicator continued its relentless climb toward numbers that represented the absolute frontier of what was possible in an F-5 Tiger II. Each increment brought new challenges as the aircraft encountered shockwave patterns and pressure distributions that pushed its structural design toward theoretical limits. Sarah could feel minute vibrations in the airframe that indicated the Tiger II was being subjected to forces that its engineers had probably never imagined when they designed the aircraft decades earlier. The altimeter was unwinding rapidly as the F-5 plunged toward Earth in its controlled fall from the edge of space. 30,000 feet, 25,000, 20,000 to each 1,000-foot milestone marked another step deeper into the most dangerous portion of the dive, where the combination of extreme speed and increasing air density would create conditions that could destroy the aircraft in milliseconds if perfect control were not maintained. At Mach 2.0, Sarah crossed the threshold into truly unexplored territory. No F-5 had ever flown this fast, and the aircraft's behavior became increasingly foreign as aerodynamic forces acted on surfaces that had been designed for much lower velocities. Control inputs that would have produced predictable responses at normal speeds now generated complex interactions between shock waves, pressure distributions, and structural deflections that challenged her ability to maintain the precise flight path required for safe completion of the maneuver. The physical sensation of flying at twice the speed of sound was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. The F-5 seemed to slice through the atmosphere with a sharpness that made the air itself feel solid, as if the aircraft were cutting through crystal rather than gas molecules. Every control input produced immediate and dramatic effects, requiring the kind of anticipatory flying that could only be achieved through complete understanding of both the aircraft's capabilities and the physics governing its behavior at these extreme velocities. Communication with ground control became increasingly difficult as radio signals struggled to penetrate the ionized air surrounding the high-speed aircraft. Sarah could hear fragments of transmissions, but the words were distorted and broken, creating an eerie sense of isolation that emphasized just how far beyond normal operations she had traveled. She was truly alone now, flying at the very edge of what was possible, with only her own skill and preparation standing between success and catastrophe. The dive continued towards its climax, with the F-5 approaching speeds that existed only in the realm of theoretical possibility. But Sarah Chen, the quiet woman who had been ridiculed for her reserved demeanor and methodical approach to flying, was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come not from those who make the most noise, but from those who understand that true mastery requires the courage to push beyond every limitation that others have accepted as absolute. At Mach 2.1, reality itself seemed to bend around Sarah Chen and her F-5 Tiger II as they plunged through the atmosphere in a controlled fall that defied every assumption about what was possible in military aviation. The aircraft had become something beyond a conventional flying machine. It was now a precisely guided missile, cutting through air so compressed that it behaved more like liquid than gas. The roar of their passage through the sky was no longer audible inside the cockpit. They were moving so fast that they had outrun their own sound signature, leaving only an eerie silence broken by the steady hum of life support systems. Sarah's vision had narrowed to tunnel-like focus as G-forces approached the absolute limits of human endurance. Despite the protection provided by her G-suit and years of physical conditioning, she could feel consciousness balanced on a razor's edge as blood struggled to reach her brain against the crushing weight of acceleration. Every instrument on the panel required conscious effort to read, and her hands felt like they weighed hundreds of pounds as she made the minute control adjustments necessary to maintain the F-5's precise flight path. The airspeed indicator continued its inexorable climb toward numbers that seemed to mock the very concept of limitation. Mach 2.15, Mach 2.17, Mach 2.19. Each increment represented a step further into territory where the distinction between controlled flight and barely contained destruction had disappeared entirely. The F-5's airframe was singing with harmonics that indicated structural stresses approaching the theoretical failure point, yet the aircraft continued to respond to Sarah's inputs with a precision that testified to both exceptional engineering and extraordinary pilot skill. Below, the Earth rushed upward with terrifying speed as the dive continued toward its most critical phase. The altimeter was unwinding so rapidly that individual 1,000-foot markers became a blur, and Sarah knew that she was rapidly approaching the point where recovery would transition from difficult to impossible. According to her calculations, she had less than 30 seconds remaining before she would need to begin the pull-out sequence that would either demonstrate the F-5's ultimate capabilities or result in structural failure that would scatter pieces of aircraft across miles of California desert. The physics governing her situation had become so extreme that normal pilot training was essentially useless. The forces acting on the F-5 were creating aerodynamic conditions that existed nowhere in conventional flight manuals, requiring Sarah to rely entirely on theoretical knowledge and split-second decision-making abilities that had been honed through years of studying situations that most pilots would never encounter. She was writing the manual for supersonic F-5 operations in real time, with failure meaning not just professional embarrassment but immediate death. Engine performance remained stable despite conditions that exceeded every specification in the Tiger II's technical documentation. The twin J-85 turbojets were somehow managing to function normally while processing airflow at velocities that their designers had never intended them to encounter. But Sarah could see subtle changes in exhaust gas temperature and fuel flow readings that indicated the engines were operating at the very edge of their thermal and mechanical limits. Any significant increase in power demand could trigger failures that would eliminate her ability to control the aircraft during the critical recovery phase. Communication with ground control had become impossible as the ionized air surrounding the high-speed aircraft created an electromagnetic barrier that blocked radio transmissions. Sarah was completely isolated now, flying faster than any F-5 in history while subjected to forces that pushed both machine and pilot to the absolute boundaries of survival. The controllers monitoring her flight would see only a radar blip moving at impossible speed, with no way to communicate or provide assistance if something went wrong. At Mach 2.2, Sarah achieved the theoretical maximum velocity she had calculated for the F-5 Tiger II under perfect conditions. The number on her airspeed indicator seemed to glow with significance as it registered a speed that existed nowhere in official performance specifications, a velocity that transformed her quiet, methodical approach to flying into something approaching pure artistry. She had pushed the aircraft beyond every limitation that others had accepted as absolute, demonstrating that exceptional performance came not from aggressive showmanship, but from the kind of precise technical mastery that could only be achieved through years of dedicated study and preparation. but reaching maximum speed was only half the challenge. The recovery phase of the dive would test every aspect of her flying skills, as she attempted to transition the F-5 from its ballistic trajectory back to controlled flight, while managing forces that could easily exceed the aircraft's structural limitations. The pullout would need to be executed with perfect timing and precision, applying exactly the right amount of back pressure on the stick to arrest the dive without creating G-forces that would cause structural failure or pilot unconsciousness. The moment for recovery had arrived. Sarah began the most critical portion of her flight by gradually applying back pressure to the control stick, feeling the F-5's nose begin to rise as she traded airspeed for altitude in a carefully controlled energy exchange. The aircraft's response was immediate but different from anything she had experienced before. The extreme velocity and dense air at lower altitude created aerodynamic conditions that made the Tiger II feel like an entirely different aircraft from the one she had flown thousands of times before. G-forces built rapidly as the F-5's flight path began to curve from vertical toward horizontal, pressing Sarah deeper into her seat with crushing weight that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness despite years of high G training. Her vision grayed at the edges as blood flow to her brain was restricted by acceleration forces approaching 9 Gs, well beyond the normal limits of human tolerance. Only her exceptional physical conditioning and absolute determination to complete the maneuver successfully kept her conscious and capable of maintaining the precise control inputs required for safe recovery. The aircraft's structure groaned audibly as loads approached the design limits established by engineers who had never imagined their creation would be subjected to such extreme conditions. Wing surfaces deflected visibly under aerodynamic pressures that created stress concentrations at joints and attachment points throughout the airframe. Sarah could feel the F-5 fighting to hold together, as she asked it to perform beyond every specification and limitation that defined its operational envelope. Airspeed began to decrease as the recovery progressed, but the reduction from Mach 2.2 toward more manageable velocities happened slowly and required constant attention to maintain optimal flight path control. Too much back pressure on the stick would create G-forces that could cause structural failure or pilot incapacitation. Too little would result in insufficient altitude recovery and potential ground impact before the aircraft could be brought under complete control. The altimeter showed that the F-5 had descended to less than 5,000 feet above the desert floor, when Sarah finally felt the aircraft's behavior begin to return toward something resembling normal flight characteristics. The crushing G-forces gradually subsided as the flight path leveled off, allowing blood flow to return to her brain and vision to clear from the tunnel that had restricted her sight during the most intense portion of the recovery. Engine parameters remained stable throughout the pull-out sequence, though temperatures had climbed to levels that indicated the J-85 turbojets had been pushed to their absolute operational limits. Hydraulic pressures held steady, confirming that the flight control systems had somehow survived forces that exceeded their design specifications by significant margins. Most importantly, the F-5's primary structure had endured stress levels that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, demonstrating a robust design philosophy that had built safety margins into every component. As the Tiger II climbed away from the desert floor in a normal climb attitude, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment that transcended anything she had previously experienced in her aviation career. She had not only achieved the theoretical maximum performance of the F-5, but had done so while maintaining complete control throughout a maneuver that would have been impossible without exceptional pilot skill and meticulous preparation. The quiet woman who had been dismissed and ridiculed by colleagues had just demonstrated capabilities that would force the aviation community to completely reevaluate their assumptions about both aircraft performance and pilot potential.
Radio communication gradually returned as the F-5 slowed to normal flight speeds, and the ionized air around the aircraft dissipated.
Ground control's transmissions crackled through Sarah's headset with increasing clarity, revealing controllers who were clearly confused by radar readings that showed her aircraft had somehow achieved impossible velocities during what should have been a routine training mission. Their questions were urgent and concerned, reflecting both professional curiosity about apparent equipment malfunctions and genuine worry about pilot safety during what appeared to have been an emergency situation. Sarah's responses were characteristically brief and professional, as she reported her position and status while configuring the F-5 for return to Edwards Air Force Base. She provided no details about the extraordinary maneuver she had just completed, knowing that explanations would come later, during the inevitable debriefing sessions that would follow any flight that had generated unusual radar signatures and performance data. The flight home was routine and uneventful, but Sarah knew that everything had changed during those few minutes when she had pushed the F-5 Tiger II beyond the boundaries of what anyone had thought possible. Word of her achievement would spread quickly through the aviation community, carried by radar tapes and telemetry data that documented performance figures nobody would initially believe. The quiet woman who had spoken softly and carried herself with reserved dignity would soon discover that her actions had indeed spoken louder than any words she could have chosen. The wheels of Sarah Chen's F-5 Tiger II touched down on the runway at Edwards Air Force Base with the same quiet precision that had characterized her entire aviation career, but the world she was returning to had been fundamentally altered by what had transpired at 45,000 feet. The routine training mission that had begun in morning mist was concluding under afternoon sunshine that illuminated an aircraft that had just achieved the impossible and a pilot who had permanently changed the landscape of military aviation. As Sarah taxied toward the parking area, she could see ground crews and flight operations personnel gathering in unusual numbers around the flight line. Word had already begun to spread through the base about radar readings and telemetry data that defied explanation, creating the kind of excitement that emerged whenever the boundaries of known performance were pushed into uncharted territory. But Sarah maintained her characteristic calm demeanor, knowing that the real test of her achievement would come not from the immediate reaction of curious observers, but from the careful analysis that would follow. Once engineers and test pilots had time to examine the data she had generated, the post-flight inspection of her F-5 revealed an aircraft that had somehow survived forces and stresses far beyond its design specifications while showing remarkably little evidence of the extraordinary ordeal it had just endured. Paint showed minor scuffing from the high-speed airflow, and certain structural elements displayed slight deformation that indicated loads approaching failure limits, but the overall integrity of the aircraft remained intact in a way that testified to both exceptional engineering and extraordinary pilot skill. Within hours of Sarah's landing, copies of radar tapes and flight data recordings were being analyzed by teams of engineers and test pilots who initially refused to believe that an F-5 Tiger II could have achieved the velocities their instruments had measured. The evidence was undeniable, however, and as word spread beyond Edwards Air Force Base to other military installations and aerospace companies, Sarah found herself at the center of attention that she had never sought but had undeniably earned through her unprecedented achievement. The formal debriefing sessions that followed were unlike anything Sarah had previously experienced in her military career. Instead of the routine discussions that typically followed training flights, she found herself facing panels of senior officers, chief test pilots, and aeronautical engineers who peppered her with detailed questions about every aspect of the record-setting dive. How had she calculated the optimal entry parameters? What control inputs had been required to maintain stability at Mach 2.2? How had she managed to execute a successful recovery from conditions that should have resulted in structural failure or loss of consciousness? Sarah's answers were characteristically thorough and technically precise, reflecting the methodical preparation that had made the achievement possible. She presented her theoretical calculations, explained her analysis of F-5 aerodynamic characteristics under extreme conditions, and described the precise sequence of control inputs that had been required to push the aircraft beyond its known limitations, while maintaining safety margins sufficient for successful completion of the maneuver. Her quiet competence and obvious mastery of complex technical concepts gradually transformed the skepticism of her questioners into respectful admiration for both her flying skills and her understanding of advanced aerodynamic principles. The implications of Sarah's achievement extended far beyond the immediate demonstration of F-5 capabilities. Military aircraft manufacturers began reassessing the performance specifications of existing designs, recognizing that conventional testing protocols might be overlooking significant capability margins that could be accessed through exceptional pilot skill and precise flight technique. Pilot training programs were modified to incorporate lessons learned from Sarah's approach to pushing aircraft beyond their normal operating envelopes while maintaining safety and control. Most significantly for Sarah personally, the aviation community's perception of her capabilities underwent a complete transformation. Colleagues who had previously dismissed her quiet demeanor as evidence of timidity or lack of confidence suddenly recognized that her reserved nature masked an intensity and competence that far exceeded their own. The nicknames and disparaging comments that had followed her throughout her career were replaced by genuine respect and professional admiration from pilots who understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Captain Jake Morrison, whose condescending attitude had exemplified the prejudices Sarah had faced throughout her career, found himself struggling to reconcile his preconceptions with the undeniable evidence of her exceptional abilities. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, whose outdated views about women in aviation had made him a consistent source of obstruction and criticism, was forced to acknowledge that his assumptions had been not just wrong, but laughably inadequate to assess the potential of pilots who approached their profession with the kind of dedication and technical mastery that Sarah had demonstrated. The recognition that followed Sarah's achievement came in many forms, from official commendations and performance awards to invitations to speak at professional conferences. and contribute to technical publications. But perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement came from younger pilots, both male and female, who saw in her example proof that excellence in aviation was determined not by conformity to traditional stereotypes, but by competence, preparation, and the courage to push beyond accepted limitations when the situation demanded exceptional performance. Major Lisa Rodriguez, who had remained silent during the briefing sessions where Sarah had been ridiculed, privately apologized for her failure to support a colleague who had been facing unfair treatment based on prejudice rather than professional assessment. Her acknowledgement represented the broader recognition within the aviation community that exceptional pilots came in many different forms, and that the quiet competence that Sarah exemplified was often more valuable than the aggressive showmanship that had traditionally been associated with military flying. The F-5 Tiger II, that had carried Sarah to a record-setting achievement, was retired to a place of honor at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it stands today as a testament to what becomes possible when exceptional engineering meets extraordinary pilot skill. The aircraft's data plate includes a special notation documenting its achievement of Mach 2.2 during a dive that pushed both machine and pilot beyond the boundaries of what had previously been thought possible. Sarah's career continued to flourish in the years following her historic flight, with assignments to increasingly challenging test pilot positions that recognized her unique combination of technical knowledge and practical flying ability. She eventually rose to become one of the most respected voices in military aviation, contributing to aircraft design projects and pilot training programs that benefited from her understanding of what could be achieved when theoretical knowledge was combined with exceptional practical skill. The legacy of that morning at Edwards Air Force Base extends far beyond Sarah's personal achievement to influence generations of pilots who learned that true mastery of aviation requires not just courage and skill, but the kind of methodical preparation and technical understanding that can transform theoretical possibilities into practical realities. The quiet woman who had been ridiculed for her reserved demeanor had spoken with a voice that echoed through decades of aviation history, proving that the most profound statements are often made not through words but through actions that demonstrate the extraordinary potential that exists within ordinary people who refuse to accept limitations that others consider absolute. Today, Sarah Chen's name appears in aviation textbooks and technical manuals that document the evolution of high-performance flying techniques. Her approach to pushing aircraft beyond conventional limitations while maintaining safety margins has become a standard methodology taught to test pilots around the world. But perhaps most importantly, her example continues to inspire pilots who understand that exceptional performance comes not from conforming to traditional expectations, but from the courage to pursue excellence through whatever path proves most effective, regardless of whether that path matches the preconceptions of those who lack the vision to recognize true competence when they encounter it. The F-5 Tiger II, that achieved Mach 2.2 in the skilled hands of Sarah Chen, stands as a permanent reminder that the boundaries of what is possible are determined not by the limitations others accept, but by the determination and skill of those who refuse to believe that excellence has already reached its ultimate expression. In an age where breaking barriers has become commonplace, Sarah's achievement remains extraordinary because it demonstrated that the most significant barriers are often the assumptions and prejudices that prevent us from recognizing the exceptional potential that exists within individuals who approach their calling with the quiet confidence that comes from true mastery of their craft.